Napoleon's financial legacy, the silent power that turned an empire, invisible mechanisms of governance. Napoleon Bonaparte did not conquer Europe solely through victories on the battlefield. His power was also shaped by signatures, seals, and financial records. Behind the roar of artillery, there existed a quiet but effective mechanism: treasury officials, notaries, bankers, and clerks. Just as generals commanded armies, they managed the financial resources of the state. To the public, Napoleon was known as a military genius, achieving seemingly impossible victories and leading bold campaigns. Yet this does not tell the whole truth. The empire rose because Napoleon reorganized France's financial structure from the ground up. He grasped a reality that many previous leaders had missed. A state can temporarily defeat its enemies, but to do so permanently requires financial supremacy. Here is the untold story: how a young Corsican, inheriting a post-revolution treasury in ruins, built a powerful financial system over 15 years of war, law, and modernization. France before Napoleon. Financial collapse. By the late 18th century, France, behind a facade of grandeur, was a financial wreck. The monarchy had collapsed under its own debt. For decades, kings had borrowed to finance wars and the luxuries of court life, exempting the wealthiest classes from taxes while burdening the poor. The 1789 revolution overturned the political structure but did not solve the financial problems. The new government attempted an emergency solution with paper money called assignats, allegedly backed by church property. At first, it seemed magical, painless liquidity, but soon it spiraled into uncontrolled inflation. By the mid-1990s, prices had skyrocketed, trust had collapsed, and daily commerce was clogged with uncertainty. Armies marched in wooden clogs. Creditors demanded coins instead of paper. France had a political vision but lacked a solid financial backbone. Napoleon's financial reforms, the foundation of trust. In 1799, Napoleon stepped into this chaos as first consul. At 29, he was a well-educated soldier and a natural systems thinker. He recognized what was truly necessary: reliability. Before commanding an army, you must manage a currency. For a nation under the shadow of revolution, he took a radical step and founded a bank. Distinct from the old court-dominated system, it was a hybrid structure, serving both state stability and economic flow. In 1800, he established the Banque de France. Private investors provided capital, and the state offered privileges and guidance. This mix was deliberate. Public money alone is vulnerable to political interference. Private money alone could fall into another oligarchy's hands. The new bank would discount commercial notes, regulate payments, and most importantly, issue banknotes in Paris under strict rules. The message was clear: your money is valid. Your wages can be spent with confidence. Trust is established not through words, but through solid foundations. Napoleon built two powerful pillars. First, he professionalized the operation of the treasury. He appointed Nicolas Francois Mollien to manage the public coffers with a discipline France had not seen for generations. Cash flows were centralized, debts recorded and reduced. The state abandoned improvisation and began keeping orderly accounts. He introduced a new tangible currency for France. In 1803, the franc germinal was defined in precise weights of silver and gold. After years of paper illusions, the unit of account regained real value. This was not a financial trend, but a social contract. Bakers, soldiers, and suppliers needed to believe that tomorrow's money would retain its value today. The franc germinal delivered that. Tax reform and oversight, the financial backbone. But money is only as strong as the taxes that back it. Napoleon knew that under the Bourbons, leaving taxes to private collectors had caused corruption and discontent. He abolished this system. The state would collect its own revenues. Four main pillars were tightened and enforced: land taxes, personal and movable property taxes, professional licenses, and eventually consumption taxes consolidated into unified levies. Inspectors carried ledgers instead of cash bags. Land records were expanded. Valuations had to be based on measured acreage, not negotiation. In 1807, he established the Supreme Audit Court to monitor the flow of public funds with the same rigor demanded in the field. In his model, Oversight was not an afterthought. It became the nervous system of trust. War finance, a self-funding empire. Once the financial foundation was rebuilt, Napoleon turned to what would define his era: funding continuous wars without bankrupting the monarchy. Here he displayed his most modern approach. He treated war as a business with cash flow. Victories were not only strategic successes, but also sources of revenue. Indemnities were collected from defeated states. Supplies of grain, horses, uniforms, and metals were priced and recorded. Occupied territories were made responsible for feeding occupying forces. The treasury was protected from overextension because the front lines financed themselves. After Jena in 1806, contributions flowed. Following the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, more money came from vanquished nations. The empire became a self-funding mechanism as long as victories continued. Napoleon diversified channels. In 1803, he sold Louisiana to the United States for $15 million in cash and bonds, favoring liquid assets and the rejection of an indefensible Western colony over a dream of expansion. He converted administrative chaos in conquered territories into taxable systems, applied the Napoleonic Code, re-established customs, and brought local treasuries into the program. He envisioned credit mechanisms to keep trade alive. Municipal savings banks and regional discount houses ensured that trade remained active as armies advanced. The economy was not a side issue, it was a second front. The Continental system, a stress test. Every structure has a stress test. For Napoleon, this appeared in the seas he could not control. In 1806, he implemented the Continental system, closing European ports to British goods to economically strangle Britain. On paper, this was a strategic financial maneuver: cut off the enemy's trade revenue, weaken puppet mechanisms, and break their will, without fighting. In practice, human behavior undermined policy. Smuggling surged, neutral flags masked shipments, coastal towns cooperated with commerce. The blockade weakened allies economically, generated discontent, while Britain adapted, reorganizing trade and financial channels. Ports went silent, prices fluctuated, and tools intended to strangle the enemy ended up hurting friends. Napoleon responded by tightening internal pressure: more customs officers, more seizures, harsher penalties. The lesson for modern leaders is clear: coercion may temporarily uphold policy, but it cannot replace economic reality. Markets always find a way. The state spends its treasury trying to plug the holes. The more force applied, the more fragile the system becomes. Napoleon learned this through rising costs long before official reports recorded it. Cracks emerge. Russia and the balance sheet catastrophe. For a time, victories masked the pressure. Austerlitz financed one year, Wagram another, but arithmetic changed. The real test came with snow. The 1812 Russian campaign was not only a military disaster, but also a balance sheet killer. Lost soldiers were not just uniforms and rifles, they represented the most costly element of the state: trained human capital. Dead horses on the snow were not only a tragedy, they symbolized the collapse of mobility that the treasury had sustained for a decade. Pre-positioned supplies were burned during retreats. Contribution models shifted overnight. The front lines could no longer finance themselves and had to divert resources from the center to rebuild what the ice had destroyed. Creditors who once turned notes rapidly hesitated. Even the best-managed treasury could not fund a war at a pace that tax law could not meet. Napoleon's ending legacy? The financial backbone. Yet, crucially, the structure he built did not perish with him. When Paris fell in 1414 and the emperor was exiled, the bank survived. The Franc Germinal endured. The audit court continued counting. Tax collectors kept performing their duties. France had been given a financial backbone. This is Napoleon's deeper legacy, and why we still live under his shadow. He did not merely conquer Europe, he standardized a nation. Law, money, and administration could be transformed into a resilient state machine, enduring far longer than its founder. The deeper one studies his era, the more it reads like a manual for the modern age. A central bank combining private shareholders and public purposes, a stable currency backed by tangible metal, a broad, transparent, internally collected tax system,
and a treasury managed by professionals rather than patrons. And war, no matter how skillfully executed, can bankrupt even the mighty if peace does not finance it. The empire was extraordinary because its components were ordinary. Stability has no magic, only structure, execution, and incentives aligned with reality.
Warning: fragility and modern parallels. But if the story stops here, you miss the warning hidden in victory. Continuous external revenue, indemnities, requisitions, looting, or today's easier version, persistent deficits justified by growth, carry the same hidden risk. Such systems accustom the state to dependency as long as victory or momentum persists. Fixed costs feel normal. Bigger armies, larger bureaucracies, thicker roads, grander programs. Then comes shock revenue, winter, war, recession, crisis, and the state realizes the cash engine beneath the splendor cannot bear the load. Only then do governments resort to modern-looking yet historically consistent tools: aggressive money printing, emergency borrowing, and a quiet hope that remaining trust will suffice. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Economic history records these choices.
Napoleon's correct moves. Consider what Napoleon got right even after his time. First, money. The Franc Germinal's link to gold and silver was not ideological, but psychological. After years when paper money melted in people's hands, France needed a reference point beyond politics. If your unit of account is measured against something tangible, contracts stabilize, wages gain meaning, and state promises feel real. This reliability lowered borrowing costs. Investors lend at reasonable rates if they believe repayment will come in a currency that still buys bread. This single design decision facilitated everything from road building to grain trade. The administrative nervous system. Next, the administrative nervous system. Direct tax collection went beyond revenue. It mapped the productive reality of the nation. Cadastres let the state know where farms were, their size and ownership. Audits revealed who paid and who did not. This knowledge was power, used not only for collection, but also to enable targeted investments. Canals where trade needed water, ports where customs could expand, schools for future officials and engineers. Money was not mere numbers. Napoleon's France learned to record reality. Law and finance united. Law. The Napoleonic Code is often talked as a legal milestone rather than a financial achievement. Yet property rights, contracts, and inheritance rules are the oxygen of credit. When merchants know how disputes are resolved, heirs understand inheritance distribution, and lenders know how collateral converts to cash, courts produce predictable outcomes, turning into cash flow machines. Napoleon's legal standardization reduced frictions that constricted regional markets. A policy from Lyon could be understood in Antwerp. This was finance hidden in jurisprudence. Fragilities. Yet while strengthening France's financial structure, Napoleon also created fragilities every modern state would recognize in its mirror. The Continental system was first. Attempting to blockade the greatest maritime trader without naval dominance made him dependent on coercion, not competitive advantage. It punished local port economies, shadowed trade, and incentivized corruption. The tighter he tightened, the more valuable smuggling became. Economic warfare requires enforcement. Trade requires consent. When politics tries to reverse this, budgets bleed unpredictably. The second fragility was the reliance of strategic finance on momentum. Victories served forward financing functions. This affected planning assumptions not only in tents, but in ministries. When revenue halted, pride was not the only casualty. The cash cycle fractured. After the Russian campaign, the treasury was extraordinarily organized under normal stress, yet catastrophically vulnerable to extraordinary shocks. Napoleon's genius could compel men to march, but it could not make arithmetic forgive.
Modern significance. Lessons for today. Now shift the lens to today. This is no museum piece. Napoleon's financial state structure still parallels modern default operating systems. Every major country operates with a central bank that links public goals with private channels.
Every serious economy knows the reliability of its currency quietly determines borrowing costs, growth, and geopolitical reach. Every finance minister understands that competent tax administration, reliable audits, and predictable property law attract more investment than slogans ever could. And every government, when tested with endless incentives or perpetual war, hits the same wall. Mathematics, patience, and trust have limits. Modern leaders have tools Napoleon lacked: fiat currencies unbound to metal, instant debt markets absorbing trillions to buffer shocks that would have toppled 19th century states. Yet this invites the trap of treating the extraordinary as normal. Emergency printing becomes routine, deficits appear as permanent investment, and trust commitments multiply. The state assumes it can finance today based on tomorrow's victories or growth. When this fails, Napoleon's silent mechanism speaks a different language, not the hum of order, but the hiss of pressure.
What should you, as a viewer, learn from history? First, financial literacy is not a hobby, it is citizenship. Understanding how currency reliability reduces borrowing costs allows you to interpret central bank statements not as words, but as actionable consequences. Knowing how tax administration maps an economy reveals when reform hides behind the mask of transparency. Recognizing law as the skeleton of credit explains why sudden rule changes spook capital. Economic history is not dusty dates. It is a guide to where power resides, how it moves, and who pays when it changes. Second, real wealth is not measured by rising charts. Napoleon's story shows that lasting prosperity comes from structure. Money people trust, taxes they understand, courts they believe in, and accounts they can verify. These components overcome temporary fixes, the paper miracles of revolutionary years, the illusion that a continent under blockade must remain poor, and the misconception that victory alone guarantees revenue. Your life may be smaller than a state, but principles scale. Build your finances on cash flows you control, in-demand skills, and meaningful assets under tight monetary conditions, not loose money alone. Speculation feasts, structure fills winters. Third, money and power remain married. Napoleon understood that coins and cannonballs served the same master. When the financial system serves the plan can move mountains. When the plan ignores the limits of the financial system, the mountain slides back. Look around. Sanctions turn banking lines into battlefields. Interest rate moves determine which nations breathe and which choke. When currency reliability disappears, no decree brings it back. Leaders who remember survive. Those who forget become history's warning. Final image to remember: an open ledger beside a map. Napoleon lived his life with both. When columns and contours aligned, nothing could stop him. When parchment lines outran lines in books, defeat was already marching. History does not repeat, but if you fail to understand, it can crush you in the same way. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History keeps the answers and will show you where to look.